Thank you for taking part in the Assessment Review Summit. The theme this year is Industry as Partners in Assessment. So I guess the biggest change since you were in Australia last has been the Higher Education Standards Framework. That's come into effect from the 1st of January. And that's really moved the game on. So we're now focusing away from subject unit level and onto course level learning outcomes and assuring those course level learning outcomes. And in particular, of course, the methods of assessment are appropriate for those course level learning outcomes. So I guess my first question to you would be, why is peer review assessment so important? And why does the framework articulate that it has to be external?
Well, I guess the emphasis on external is because of a concern about some notion of national equity, national standards. Certainly that's been the growing case in the UK. Mm-hmm. So peer review, the need that someone, not you, someone, as we've said, external, can come in with a fresh pair of eyes and give you some comparability, is the best way of approaching that.
Mm-hmm. And tell me why peer review is so important in raising standards for assessment.
Well, because if you don't have it, how do you know what your level of standards is? Mm-hmm. And more importantly, how do the stakeholders, and certainly, as I say, that's become the growing issue in the UK, ever since the infamous question, I can't remember how many years ago now, from the Select Committee, is a 2-1 in history at Oxford Brookes the same as a 2-1 in history at Oxford? And the right answer, which wasn't the answer given, is, well, we've no way of knowing. We don't have sufficient procedures to actually give you an answer to that. So I think there's been a growing issue about standards and national standards, and that's linked to grade inflation, accusations of grade inflation anyway, and a whole host of things. So I think that's what's taking us down this road to the notion of peer review, and going back to your first question, the importance of external peer review, getting comparison outside the institution.
Thank you. So we don't have external examiners in Australia, and I understand that the external examining system is being reviewed by yourself and your colleagues. Perhaps you could explain to our Australian audience how that works and what are the key changes?
Well, yes, we've had the so-called external examiner system for a very long time, and the way it's worked, I'm loath to claim that anything is universally true about UK higher education, but as a huge generalisation, the way it's worked is that every course or programme will be expected to have an external examiner. So someone in that discipline from another institution who will do a number of things, actually has a number of roles, but it will involve looking at the course documentation, it will involve looking at assessments in particular, it will involve looking at examples of student work, it will involve going to meetings with the course team, attending assessment boards, panels, whatever you call them, and on all of that. And we've had that for a very long time. We actually, the group that I've been involved in carried out a review. We published a review, and that was one of a series. I mean, over the last 10, 15 years, there have been a number of looks at what we do as external examining. In terms of the role, it's arguably got at least 3 quite distinct roles. One, it acts as a kind of what we've called in some of our writing a process checker. It acts as a sort of audit. The external can check whether the university's procedures, processes have been kept to, whether the students have been treated fairly within those processes. The second role, the one that I think is most appreciated and why the whole system is quite highly regarded, is that of a critical friend. that the program team has this person with a fresh pair of eyes who can come in and say, oh, well, is that really doing that? Is that really assessing that outcome? Or could you do it better, or whatever? Or at our place, we do this and it seems to work. You might like to give that a try. The third very important part of the role is supposed to be as some kind of arbiter of national standards. Now, in our review, we pointed out that the first two roles are being done to varying degrees well. There is some suggestion that some external examiners feel it's moved to become more of a process checker, which they're less keen on than the critical friend role. But we argued in our report that there is absolutely no way you, as an individual, with even if you've worked in 3, 4, 5 institutions, can come in and be an arbiter of national standards. That's not possible. So the latest project that we're involved in is attempting to address that in a number of ways. Because, to finish the point, our funding council has decided that this is the direction they want to go in terms of quality assurance. They want to move away from the very big audit model that we've had with the Quality Assurance Agency and so on. And given we have external examiners and it's a highly regarded system, and given that they're the only ones, arguably, who actually drill down to the level of seeing actual student work, that this is the way they want to go in terms of quality assurance.
When I was an external examiner in the UK, I think the only professional development training I got was someone handed me a booklet and said, there you go, off you go to your institution and do some examining. How is professional development going to have to change to make external examiners better at making those critical judgments?
Okay. Well, I mean, I think it has changed probably since that time. I think the big development comparatively recently has been more institutions offering training to people who are becoming externals at their institution and inviting them in. Clearly, I don't know of a case where it's compulsory, so my assumption is in almost all cases that's voluntary, so it doesn't mean that everyone gets that training. And secondly, the training tends to focus on issues around the internal workings of that university or that program, or both. So, whether there are certain appeals procedures in this institution, how processes work, whether there are university-wide assessment criteria. So it tends to focus on that university and its workings. Since the decision by the Funding Council that they want to move the quality assurance into the realm of external examiners, or become reliant on external examiners, our project, which has now just been going for 1 year, has been to develop professional development for external examiners on the fundamental issues around standards, and I would say around assessment literacy. And one of, I think, the most important messages in the program that we've developed is that you are almost certainly being appointed as an external on the grounds of being an expert in your discipline. You are being brought in as a disciplinary expert with an external set of eyes. And we're saying, well, actually, you've also got to be an assessment expert as well. And if you like, a curriculum expert, but certainly an expert on the role of assessment within the curriculum and the notion of standards. So we've spent, we're now, as I say, at the end of the first year, we've developed a face-to-face training. We don't call it Training Professional Development Day. We're in the process of trying to make an online version. The existing one already has a blended element. There's stuff the people do before they come. We've done it with some volunteer institutions. We've done some regional ones, so people from, institutions within that region coming together. And that is being rolled out further next year. Hopefully, I think there's a meeting later this month to decide whether we keep the funding for another year. But hopefully that's all going to be rolled out. So we are developing that development.
So what institutional themes or issues arise from external examiners' reports? We're very much in Australia talking about, closing the loops. How is the assessment quality loop closed when those reports are generated?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, the reports, I think now I'm 99% sure that the reports have to be available somewhere online to people to see them, so that the reports themselves become public documents. Again, I'm loath to say it's true in all cases, but in almost all cases, if not all, there is an expectation that the course team, the quality assurance people within the institution, will expect course teams to provide a response to the externals report.
Mm.
And certainly if there have been any negative comments or issues, the internal people within quality assurance in that institution would be expecting to see responses, and may also be having conversations with the program teams about those things. But that's not all guaranteed. And I mean, I think in our review that led to our initial report, there were cases of externals who felt, they'd said the same thing for 3 years running, and it was sort of, passed on one side, or it didn't seem that anyone was seriously engaging with doing anything about it. So I think the system clearly is not foolproof, and it doesn't guarantee that the feedback, it may have a feedback loop, but to quote David Bowd, it doesn't mean that the input has an effect necessarily, and I think that is still an issue.
How does calibration fit in with a peer review of assessment process? If calibration is actually the correct word, maybe it's pre or post consensus moderation. What are your thoughts on calibration?
We've taken to using the word calibration as part of our project, and I'm taking it from the sort of what I take to be the original use of it in the Royce Sadler paper. I'm taking it to be about the calibration of assessors, and that's how we've been using it. And that's the second part of our project, because as I said, however experienced an academic may be, it's a tall order to expect them to be an arbiter of national standards. And in fact, that's an even taller order, because one of the things we showed in our report was that like-minded universities tend to appoint universities from within their groupings. So the experiences, even within 3-4 institutions, may well be in 3 or 4 similar institutions. So the notion of national standards, we've argued, requires calibration. You have got to go beyond that, I'm going to base this all on my own experience. And we have, as the second part of our project, we are now trying to encourage and work with subject disciplines to engage with the calibration of the people within those disciplines who are acting as external examiners. And we see that as sort of part 2 of the professional development, and both parts being crucial. I mean, to an extent, we're doing it the wrong way round for all sorts of reasons I won't go into. But we certainly see that the rounded, fully qualified external examiner should have done both the development and be calibrated within their subject discipline. Now, this is clearly, early days, and we're now working with a number of disciplines. Geography, I think, are probably the ones who've been the most enthusiastic that we've talked to, worked with. They've already, in fact, carried out a calibration exercise, getting people from different institutions together. And we're working with others, and we've got a phased approach to trying to bring in more disciplines to encourage them to think about how to do this. And as part of, I think, the original project brief, we're also supposed to be encouraging them to maybe think about different possible ways of calibrating. So we're not being prescriptive, although we are sharing with them, for example, the work that Mark Freeman's done with the accountancy people here in Australia. We've taken that as an example of what appears to be a very successful attempt at doing this. But we're saying, actually, we're prepared to work with you on contextual differences and look for other mechanisms and ways that you might do it. But I think, for me, I hope it's going to be a powerful selling point to academics and the disciplines. I think this is a real opportunity for the disciplinary communities to own their own standards, to actually say, we are the experts, we are the historians, we are the physicists, these are our standards, and to, if you like, almost take back control from where we've been with this central body, Quality Assurance Agency, coming in and sort of looking down on and demanding certain things. But yes, calibration, very much where we're going, but very early days.
Very Brexit. So I was involved in leading the external referencing of assessment standards project, or the EROS project. And although that was kind of post-moderation of assessment, so we were looking at student work samples, we found we built up some very powerful communities of practice and networks because it wasn't blind, because people could talk to one another and discuss assessment standards. Should peer review of assessment be blind?
I think this is a tricky one. I think it really depends what is the primary focus of what you're doing. So, I mean, I think, and I think it's interesting you talked about pre and post. I think if the primary focus of the peer review is to try and come to a consensus judgment about a particular student's piece of work, about a particular grade, what should it get, and so on, I think there are arguments that should be blind, that we don't, and even to the point, but maybe we don't know what the grade other people gave it, should be blind. Because it seems to me as soon as you put an institution on it, as soon as you put a grade on it, there is the potential that that's going to influence the decision you come to. If we're simply using this piece of work as the starting point for a discussion in order to calibrate assessors, then I think you're absolutely right. I think the relationships are important. And I don't necessarily see the need for it to be blind. Maybe still blind about the original grade. But again, the work that I know best, Mark Freeman's work with the accountants, I mean, they start off, as I understand it, not knowing what institutions the works come from, not knowing the grade. They, whatever group they're in, all grade it. And then when they all get together face to face, obviously they know who they each are, and they have a discussion, and then they start moving to that consensus. But all with a view not ultimately to decide whether this student deserves this grade or whatever, but with a view to calibrating them as assessors. And I think that's important. I do think, though, there's a lot of if we're trying to make ourselves more reliable, I also do think there's an argument that pre-calibration or pre-moderation is better than post. So I think I can think we use a paper by Saunders and I can't remember the other author as one of the bits of work we do on the professional development day, and that's the case where it was for dissertation marking. The team spent a lot of time talking about what the criteria for marking the dissertation were going to be, writing themselves sub-notes about what did they really mean by, analysis, or what do they mean by this? So they made quite detailed preparation before they went off and marked anything. And then there was a second round where they came back and they'd marked a few, and they had further discussion about, well, this is a bit of a problem, this is a bit of a problem. And they further wrote guidance on what they were going to do. And the paper goes on to say, you know, not surprisingly, they got much more reliable as assessors and, you know, etc. So in that sense, I think pre rather than post, because once we get post, then we start having, you know, I want to defend the grade I gave it, a whole number of other things, it seems to me, come into play. And I think we then end up on this focus about the grade rather than the wider issues about what do we mean by this criterion or, you know, the standard.
So the theme of this conference is about engaging kind of all stakeholders, and how can we better do that? So how can we get institutions, industry, professional bodies in a kind of community of practice to raise assessment standards?
Well, I mean, again, I'm optimistic, and the risk of becoming repetitive in this. I take the lead from the accountancy matters, but you know, the achievement matters people, the assessment matters. They, I understand, have worked very closely with the professional bodies in accountancy. I think they may even have put up money, and they certainly come to the calibration events and say, well, from an industry point of view, we think this. And certainly with our attempts at calibration, we are hoping, where applicable, we will hopefully bring in the professional bodies, that they in fact might even be a driving force with some of the subject groupings, that, you know, they've got a vested interest, it seems to us, in standards. So whether we can get them involved in whatever way, I think is all to the good. And so getting them involved because they've got a vested interest, getting them involved because it's going to help them interpret their standards in practice, and maybe even getting them to fund things or, you know, make the wheels move.
Do you think there's a potential conflict there? Should we be giving employers what they want, or should we be giving them what they need?
I didn't mention employers. And I'm not sure. I think I'm not sure. I hadn't really thought about it. I'm not sure about bringing employers into the calibration argument. I see the accountancy bodies as slightly different. I could see there's a vague grey line there. Certainly, I think the professional bodies, whether it's nursing and midwifery, whether it's the engineering councils, etc., I think we should be getting them involved in the ways that I've just said and for why. The role of employers, I think, I'm not sure about, and I certainly haven't thought about it in terms of calibration.
I thought about employers in terms of industry, because they're the kind of employers, and they have a big interest in this, a vested interest, and it's just a case of that kind of nuance between those. They have a vested interest, but I'm not sure to what extent, if at all, you want to get them engaged in the discussion about subject standards. I can see professional standards, then we get into professional bodies, etc., and it starts to blur the line. Now, Australia is a lot bigger than the UK, and you have your external examiners there. I know they get paid to move around. We don't quite have that luxury here, so we need to bring people online. So in the EROS project, we did an awful lot of stuff online and sharing. Now, University of Tasmania, through Sarah Booth's work, and of course the higher ed services have created a peer review portal, which allows us to bring institutions for peer review of assessment together, benchmarking, or even course review and other professional activities. Now, we've showed you the portal. What are your thoughts about a portal for sharing peer review activities and going outside of Australia, even to perhaps the UK, and getting that kind of shared understanding of standards across several countries?
I think firstly, I see absolutely the logic of using the technology as much as you can, and if it can help you overcome distance and those sorts of issues, yes, that makes obvious sense. And, you know, I think I did spend a little bit of time on the portal. I wouldn't claim to have fully got my head around it, but it looked like it had potential. It was potentially going to be useful in a number of ways. And of course, the accountancy model does use technology in the first iteration, as we said. You know, you get sent this stuff electronically, you use Spark Plus or whatever it's called, and make decisions and things before people end up meeting. And while I've been here, I've also seen the work that you've been involved with for chemistry, for example, you know, that piece of software. So I think, yes, it clearly makes sense to make use of the technology, and I think it's got an absolute part to play. If we're getting down to the calibration of assessors, though, I can't help feeling that there is still a need for actual, probably synchronous dialogue. I'm not sure the degree to which asynchronous dialogue. I think it's worth exploring, but I think even if it's a Skype conversation between 3 or 4 people, I think there's something about a synchronous discussion where you and I can argue and someone else can throw in their comments, which I think is trickier with asynchronous, typed comments or whatever. So I wonder if there doesn't need to be some kind of more, personal face-to-face, even if it's screen-to-screen sort of conversations. But I also understood from the portal that it seems to be trying to do a number of different things. I mean, not being rude about it, but it seems to be a sort of, I think you used the phrase about dating app, that actually, the need to find other people and so on. That seems to be a, perfectly sensible thing to try and do if that's an issue and a problem. And then you've got other things it seems to be trying to do around peer review and program review and so on, over and beyond calibrating assessors. So it seems to be trying to do a number of things, all of them potentially worthy. And I don't think I'm actually qualified to suggest whether, it's going to be the best thing or how well it's going to work until it's further developed.
Yes, the Neros project, the matchmaking that we called it, was always the hardest thing. Finding the right people at different institutions to do that peer review was always the challenge. But you're right. I think that face-to-face is really important, even if it's done online, because that builds up trust. Yeah. And you need trust to do peer review.
I think so.
Just to finish off, if you look at your crystal ball for a minute, where do you think all this is heading?
Things are so uncertain in higher education, aren't they? Either both in your country and mine, I would suggest. That you get a change of government, you get a change of minister. Things can be, our project in the UK could get scrapped tomorrow because the funding council could change its mind. We might not even have a funding council. It is getting restructured anyway. The person who's currently in charge of it might not be there. So we're constantly, it seems to me, on sort of shaky grounds, aren't we? Assuming that there aren't any of those major rifts, changes. So far, I think I've been very pleasantly surprised. I mean, people who know anything about me may feel that I'm usually a bit negative, cynical. I think we've achieved a lot in our project. I think you guys have achieved a lot in Australia. You've, I think, led the way with this notion about calibration and where you're now moving. I think the decision to... Some of my colleagues actually, I'm not sure, agree. I think some of them felt we should find some other system. But I think the decision to build on the well-respected external examiner system has been a sensible decision if we can carry off this crucial final part of calibrating them. And I've been very pleasantly surprised by the reception we've had from geography, from the English people we've been talking to. The vets are another group that we've made some progress with, and they are now, I think, talking about doing something at their forthcoming conference. And we've got another set of disciplines that we're working with. So I'm as confident as I could be, given the magnitude of the task. But the notion that we're going to get every single external examiner in the UK professionally developed, and we're going to get every subject discipline in the UK engaged in some kind of calibration, is going to mean we're going to have a fair wind and support for about another 10 years. So the chances of some ghastly change happening in the interim are, quite likely.
Chris Rust, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. Enjoy the rest of your time in Australia.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.